Let's dive right into Hosea chapter 11. The scene is a trial. The accused is an extremely wayward heir who has put his family in terrible jeopardy. Elders gather at the gate. The trial begins.
So it's poetry, and I've marked the different divisions. If you come to our Psalms Bible study, this is a shameless plug, Monday evenings up at the seminary, we have drinks afterwards. We get into this poetry analysis. But you can see either an asterisk in the Book of Common Prayer, or I've used a forward slash, marks the half point in the line, and the two parts go together. The second usually, I think Melody talked a little bit about this last week if you were here. The second part of the two-part line pushes the thought ahead, sort of a what's more, while still keeping in mind the first part. When Israel was a child, I loved him. This is God talking. So this is the very origins of the people when they were slaves in Egypt. And out of Egypt, I called out my son. I called him out of Egypt. So God is in the mode of thinking back. I'm the parent of a 13-year-old. I often think back to when she was just a baby and all the times that we shared. And this is what God is doing. All of these loving sentiments and memories of relationship with the people. Parent and child. I called my son. Elsewhere, Hosea will use a different metaphor, husband and wife. Same intimacy. And that's really what's missing in the culture of the time. There's all this focus on fecundity and harvest and bounty, but no search for real intimacy. What does that remind you of? 21st century culture. Sex is everywhere, but no one knows how to find intimacy and relationship and love. That is one of our major struggles in existence. So you gotta love the prophets because they bring you right into contact with that struggle. So immediately there's problems. And what's the problem? Refusal to seek intimacy. Go after other deities like Baal, Asherah. Don't have any sort of sense of commitment. And what happens to God? God gets hurt, emotionally hurt. That's also a hard one. Sometimes in church we talk about God as not really capable of human emotions, but if you read the prophets you find out that that's completely wrong. God is incredibly vulnerable, the most vulnerable one in the relationship. The more I called to the people, the more they abandoned me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to idols. But then he goes back to the reminiscence. And I've got here a Rembrandt sketch of parents. And Rembrandt did a number of these little sketches because it's such a moment of intimacy that it's hard for a parent to ever forget when the child is, oh my gosh, they're grabbing on to the couch and moving around. Let me hold their hand. They're walking. A father will never forget when his daughter that moment that the daughter first walks. And God is saying, I taught them to walk. And when they fell down, I took them in my arms and I held them. But they didn't realize that I was the one who was doing it. It's just heartbreaking. It's just kills you. I like to use some artwork when I teach. This is a 20th century portrait of some of these dynamics as we experience them now. The artist has painted his wife, but as you can see, although he's a serious figure with the thin lips, her big lower lip and her posture indicate that she's much more free-going, adventurous, wild, and it begins to cause problems in his relationship. And part of the problem is there's this distance between them. She might blame it on the fact that he's represented by the mask, right? Because if we fully experience God and all of God's selfness, it would kill us, right? God is so utterly different that power of otherness and holiness we have to grow into that in order to be able to stand. You should be able to see just from the eyes that there's more behind the mask, and she's just too interested in going out bars to develop that relationship. So as the poem progresses, we move from the youth to the son. This is a Filipino modern artist. Again, existential dynamics that we're familiar with. Probably doesn't even know why he's doing what he's doing, but it's causing a breach in the relationship and a lot of puzzlement on both sides. And then finally, the prodigal son abandons the family and ends up, it's not that any special act of divine judgment was necessary, he ends up with the unclean, impure swine. And this poem in Hosea 11 is very much like Jesus' parable of the prodigal son. And in fact, Jesus probably got the whole thing. He probably stole it blatantly from Hosea. So you can see God wrestling as we move through. The son is destroying himself. God's people are destroying themselves. They're essentially enslaved. And that's language that we can relate to. I think modern congregations sometimes have a real hard time with some seminary professor getting up and saying, you all are all sinners. Maybe we don't feel like sinners, but if you come up and say, well, we're all enslaved. We try so hard for intimacy, but we don't get it. We try to feel better about ourselves, but everything we do, we don't seem to find it. We seem trapped. We need somebody to step in and just kind of help us to fill that void that we have inside of us. So the people have done this to themselves. We've done this to ourselves. And here, the poetry suddenly gets a little bit different. There's actually new poetry. There's a lot more tightness, a lot more rhythm, a lot more very tight parallelism. So for example, this painful how, this agonizing how, in Hebrew it's even stronger. Ache, ache, how. And then it's repeated again, how. So there's not only this internal parallelism that Melody was talking about, but the lines are double strength. You get one line here, how, blah, blah, and then repeated out here, how, ache, ache, ache. Just a double strength lament the poetry is bringing you into the agony of God as God suffers in love over the lack of intimacy that God is experiencing. And then even the beats. One, two, three, 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. And then you see it in the parallel, externally parallel line. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. That's a special kind of meter that you study in Hebrew poetry. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. It's a kina meter. It's typical meter for lament. When you're in agonizing suffering, that is the way that your poetry comes out. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. It's sort of lilting, it's halting, it's blue. I mean, one thing that Hebrew does is it just forces you, because it's not your native language, to look more closely. I mean, how often when this is preached on or taught, do we look this closely at a verse and just see the power of it? Not often, because I think we assume, yeah, it's just a line and it's a big book. Let's push ahead. So this is Rembrandt's famous painting of the return of the prodigal son, and this is exactly what Jesus saw in Hosea 11. I'm being imaginative here. Jesus doesn't say he got it from Hosea, but I think he almost had to. Because at the end of Hosea, even though every law in the book says that this sort of son should be stoned to death, he's completely violated every rule that sons should behave by. God is like tearing God's hair out, and he comes to the resolution, well, you know what, I'm not human, I'm completely other, I'm not going to follow the normal judicial proceeding here. I've got a certain flexibility as the creator, and I've got, even judges are normally given some, I think Trumper mentions this in your book, that judges have a certain amount of flexibility. They don't have to impose the maximum sentence usually. And so God says, I can't do it. Come back to me. And even though exile eventually does come, the people still are welcomed back. So it's a huge, but not everybody's pleased. The prophets are hard to hear. Who is unhappy when the prodigal son returns? Well, the big joke is it's the fatted calf. But who also is subject? The elder son, right? He's got the royal red robes just like the father does, but he doesn't want any part of this. This guy, he was loyal, he stayed there, he worked. This guy was a loser, he didn't care a whit about anything. By the way, Henry Nouwen has a wonderful meditation on the prodigal son. If you ever want to buy a cheap little book, and you can get it as an audiobook, I think. It's a good read. Any observations now that we're here? This is definitely the God of the Old Testament, the God of Hosea, figured by the father here. I think Rembrandt was very clever in his portrayal of God. What do you notice? And if you've studied this before, I'm sure some of you have, you can chime in anyway. The son is clearly fascinating. You can see his swollen eyes. I mean, the father didn't do this to him. He looks almost like a prisoner of war with the bald head. You can see in the full painting the tattered clothes. You can see his legs sticking through. And what's interesting is his whole posture with the feet towards us and the head towards Rembrandt. Rembrandt has placed us in the position of the son. We're the son who's essentially gone through a concentration camp experience, needs freedom. And that's exactly what the Father's offering.
So much more to say, but this is supposed to be just suggestive of the richness of Hosea.